Hello, everyone. This is Prasads and welcome to our GRC Summit and fireside chat with Gavin Grounds. And the topic today is cyber risk quantification and core metrics for success. That's our topic. And Gavin, welcome. And always a pleasure to have you on these sessions and fireside chats. And as a way of introduction to our audience, Gavin is an executive director at Verizon overseeing governance, risk, and compliance functions as part of their senior executive leadership team of corporate information security. And Gavin has been at Verizon since 2018. He was brought in to transform their cyber and information risk management functions and to finalize and structure the execution of the overall global security strategy. I want to make sure I get that right, Gavin. And Gavin now leads the GRC functions, as well as Gavin is also responsible for the third-party risk across Verizon. And prior to joining Verizon, Gavin was at DXC as a CISO, and prior to that, he was at Hewlett-Packard in similar roles. And Gavin, I'm sure many of our folks on audience know who Gavin is, and he pioneered some of the concepts and innovative ideas and concepts in cyber risk, and especially cyber risk quantification. And he's a chartered engineer and a chartered IT professional, and an advisor to many corporate advisory boards. And on a personal note, Gavin is a musician and a long distance marathon runner. Welcome, Gavin, again.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here, Prasad. Thanks for having me back. Looking forward to the session.
Yeah, and thanks for joining us again. And can you tell us, our audience, a brief overview of your role at Verizon and why is cyber risk so critical for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you did a nice summary there for me, Prasad, in terms of my role here at Verizon. So as you said, I joined Verizon in 2018, and with a primary focus of transforming the way we do risk management, even the way we measure risk. And that's been, really a journey of a couple of years now. And along the way, part of the approach that I've taken is when I say about transforming the way we do risk management, it really is making quantification of risk an absolute prerequisite. For example, we look at the way we measure risk in cybersecurity traditionally, and it's always kind of gradients and colors, low, medium, high, critical, or red, amber, green. But even those relative ratings, if you like, really just don't do the business justice, because in every other aspect of business, pretty much, we measure risk in numbers. If we're doing a cash flow forecast and we want to factor in risk of bad debt or missed collections, we don't show that on the balance sheet or on the forecast as a high or a low. It's a number. It's either a percentage of cash or an actual dollar figure. Whereas in cybersecurity, we immediately go to low, medium, high, critical, or red, amber, green. And even when we think about it, just in practical terms, those relative views really are not meaningful. You can't see it while I'm sitting here on video, but for me personally, a basketball hoop is pretty high. Whereas for Michael Jordan, I don't think he would think that same basketball hoop is as high as I think it is. So again, just kind of shows a very simple example, but shows how ineffective really a qualitative method is for risk management, and why it becomes critical to do a quantitative method. And you asked the question, Prasad, why? Why is it so important? And I often describe it this way: when we think about a cybersecurity framework, the cybersecurity framework describes what we do. What risk management does is it defines why we do it, or why we don't do something. And so really then having a really effective risk management and quantification of risk really becomes table stakes. It's just a prerequisite to be able to effectively manage your cybersecurity outcomes.
Yeah, thank you for that, Gavin. Yeah, it's I can see, high, medium, low. We don't know how high it's high, and how low is low. And when you provide these red, amber, green statuses, or red, you don't know how red is red, how severe it is, and things like that. So you naturally need the quantification to express in some monetary terms, what is at stake here. Perfect. I mean, that's all, if you will, historically over the last 30 years, market risk, credit risk have evolved, and operation risk. And I can see the natural progression for cyber risk with respect to quantification. And Gavin, can you talk about cyber risk quantification, and what is it, and what it means, and why it has emerged as a major topic or a force in the cyber risk space?
Sure. Yeah. So when I talk about quantification of risk and cyber risk, many people might immediately start to think about annualized loss expectancy calculation. And yet, what I do find, Prasad, is that exclusively looking it through the eyes of ALE is actually ineffective as well. It's incomplete. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is that when we think about the way ALE is structured in the first place, it's about trying to calculate or estimate what a potential loss might be. And yet, when we do risk management in any domain of the business, the risk management is really there to support the business. So in other words, if, for example, I wouldn't have on my personal scorecard, that my objective is to reduce risk. My objective should be to optimize risk, because business is all about taking risk. But the trick is to know how much risk to take and how much risk to not take, or which risk specifically, to not take. And so it's not necessarily about reducing risk. We might need to increase our risk profile in order to enable, a much broader business opportunity. So that's one of the downsides if we look exclusively around like an ALE based model. And I think the other challenge, Prasad, when we look exclusively at ALE, is when we think about where that model came from. It's kind of based loosely on let's say the insurance model. And in many ways, it's because a lot of CISOs, it's like, hey, we have to justify our existence. We need to say, hey, you give me $1 million, and I'll avoid potentially us, spending 5 million in unplanned spend, sort of thing. It's almost like being an insurance underwriter. But really, when we think about the insurance world, invariably we're dealing with a finite number of perils. Things like whether it's fire or flood or whatever the case might be. So there's a finite number of perils, and there's actually pretty much a finite number of scenarios as well that can be applied, that would result in those perils materializing. And that's really what actuaries use, foundationally to essentially calculate what premiums they would like to collect, for that coverage. Whereas in cybersecurity, it's actually the inverse. We don't have a finite number of perils. We have an infinite number of perils, or an infinite number of scenarios. And that can be one of the challenges then when we think even about going to a risk scenario-based model, is the number of scenarios become infinite, and that's why many risk managers and many CISO organizations tend to, try and figure out what they might say, well, what are the top 15 or what are the top 10? To my mind, when you take that approach, first of all, you're doing that because there's an infinite number of scenarios. So you're trying to think, well, which are the top 10 or which are the top 15? The one that I think is the highest risk when you take a top 10 or top 15 would be number 16, as in the one that you didn't think was important enough to assess. And so the reason why I'm kind of sharing all that, Prasad, is therefore the methodology or the approach that I defined was to treat risk as a currency of its own. In other words, it's a points-based system, and I can be happy to share a little bit more detail on how that structure works. But basically, rather than going low, medium, high, critical, there's an empirical numeric value that we can assign to whether it's the value of the asset, or the functionality of the asset, or the mission criticality of the asset, but also its level of a degree of exposure, or susceptibility, or vulnerability. So that kind of methodology, then, like I said, when I talk about quantification, that's what I'm talking about. Because once you quantify, where, like say, like a points-based system where it's the cyber risk is the currency in of itself, we can then, like almost like a foreign exchange rate, we can then map that to the corresponding fiscal opportunity, or fiscal loss probabilities.
Thanks for the insights there. Very well articulated, Gavin. And what advice would you give to our audience in terms of how they need to transform their risk management strategies through cyber risk quantification, per se?
Yeah, a few people have said, including my own team, when we embarked on this journey, ourselves, is the problem just seems so massive and complex. But that's why we need quantification, because it's so massive and because it's so complex. But interestingly, and I've shared this little kind of anecdote, if you like, with some of the audience in the past, Prasad. But it reminds me of when I was a child. My grandmother, my nan, I don't know if she used to just respond in this way to make people laugh, or you should be serious. But somebody would stop and say, "Excuse me, can you tell me how to get to a certain place?" And she'd always say, "Well, I wouldn't start from here if I were you." She's obviously Irish family, And then she'd pause, and the person would look confused, and then she'd kind of laugh. But it's really a strange phrase when you say, "I wouldn't start from here if I were you." It's all, well, I can only start from here because this is where I am. Or then now putting that in the context of, well, where do where and how do we start with risk quantification? Some people say, well, you've got to start somewhere. Well, that's also an odd statement. There's no somewhere to start from except where we are. So when we think about quantification, I've always said, you go with what you do have, or start with what you do have, improve based on what you could have, and always aspire to what you should have. So when we take that approach, what I did, Prasad, is figured out, okay, well, what do I have already? So whether it's an application or a function or a process, what I already had was I already had the business impact analysis for that particular platform. In other words, how valuable is it to the business? And if you have a fairly decent business continuity plan, then there's all the clues right there in terms of which specific business processes are most critical to the business, either with the highest value or mission criticality, or whatever the case might be. So that's starting with something that you do have. And then also when we look at those business processes and then say, well, which applications and platforms are actually supporting these particular business processes? Well, that's information we already have. Now we might say, well, we've all been chasing the unicorn, if you like, or hunting the unicorn for CMDB, or asset registers and so on. But again, start with what you do have. If your asset register is 70% accurate, great. That's more than zero. And so basically, then, so you've got a line of sight on at least what most of the assets are doing, what business processes they are supporting. And then you can start to look at architectural elements. Again, it's information that we already have. And that architectural information will say, for example, how many API connections does this service have? What type of connections? Are they third-party API connections? What the connections do? Is it pushing, pulling, giving instructions, receiving instructions? But again, then we can start to quantify that, not just in terms of the number of API connections in that example, but also the kind of intrinsic value of that connection. So now what I've just really described, if you think about it, is an asset value and an attack surface. But what we're doing is we're taking what we already know and converting that into numerics. And then we can say, well, what about what does every log that we've ever collected tell us? I mean, we've probably got more log data as a community than we ever are using. And so with that, you could say, well, what kind of logs? Well, it could be, obviously firewall logs or VPN logs or server logs or application logs or, user activity logs. So basically all of that information is information that we already have access to. And so then we can, again, using numerics and quantification, pull that into the context of the numerics that we just calculated for the actual base risk itself, for the actual, what this service does, how it's architected, how exposed is it. And so that really then allows us to use exactly what we do have today. So what I've just described, Prasad, is basically it's data analytics, but it's using analytics in a meaningful way so that we can actually quantify the value and exposure of the assets that we're operating.
Thank you for that, Gavin. So in other words, in summarize, start small, identify your critical areas, tackle those first, before you embark on implementing something like a risk quantification for cyber risk across the board.
Yeah, and I would say to be very specific, Prasad, is what I just described there is actually you are starting with quantification. The minute that you're actually collecting your BIA and mission criticality information, for example, you turn that into a numeric. Now you just quantified that. So it's so that way you build I would say the sophistication of your quantification algorithm, if you like, can grow over time.
Yeah.
But you're immediately now starting with numbers, not with gradients. And so anybody in the audience could start that tomorrow, given enough time and energy. Anybody could start and embark on that tomorrow. So you can literally start a quantification journey like tomorrow morning.
Yeah, and we have been through so much in the last 2 years with the pandemic. And how are the developments of this, over the last 2 years have changed your outlook on cyber risk? Any one or two thoughts or ideas that you want to, touch on?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, Prasad, when you said how's it changed the view, if you like, of cyber risk. What it's really done is actually given really good line of sight, good clarity on cyber risk, because the methodology that I just described or highlighted a few minutes ago, that once you actually come up with an empirical numeric value of what that what the actual base risk is. So if an application is is this critical to the business or is this critical to the function? And then, as I said, you've got your kind of exposure and your architectural information there as well. That means that every single platform, every single application, or every single service can actually be assigned a numeric risk score, just because it exists. Not even thinking about actionable risk where you risk because a vulnerability was introduced or the case might be, but just that because this thing exists, this is its risk score as a numeric. And then so for every application or every platform with its own risk score, then what that allows, for example, Prasad, is for us to stack rank those. So we can go from the highest to the lowest. And like I say, that score is really a combination of its worth and its exposure. And in doing that, there's so many ways that's been effective for us. A couple of quick highlights would be, when it comes to cybersecurity controls, we now know how to index, if you like, on which controls are needed most urgently and where, because of we correlating it to that or it's being driven by that base risk score. Or another perspective is where we might be doing, say, an asset refresh. And so again, every CIO on the planet has, got finite resources, finite budget, finite hours in the week. So what that allows to do is, say, if you're going through an asset refresh program, then the risk, you can use that stack rank of risk, and that can inform some of your priority or your decisions that you're making around prioritization for a refresh. Or equally for if you're doing a cloud migration initiative, that base risk score that could be used to help inform how you prioritize which applications you might want to migrate more swiftly, and perhaps even refactor completely into the cloud, because then you can simultaneously not only get that migration completed, but you're simultaneously then being able to effect the risk, and that would be an example where you might want to drive the risk down, and then maybe that could go on the scorecard. But that's that, so there are so many just day-to-day, and monthly and quarterly decisions now that with that clarity, we can make much more effective risk-based decisions.
Right. And you touched on this earlier with respect to how the quantification evolved with insurance risk models, or minimizing your insurance losses to mitigating risk and creating a business driver, right, and based model. Anything more you want to with respect to your insights, what you have learned at Verizon that you want to give an advice to our audience here?
Yeah, and I touched on it a little bit as well, Prasad. But it's that when we think about the insurance model or the ALE model, and I referred to it earlier that we have unlike insurance programs, we have an infinite number of scenarios. And
Right.
So I said before about that it would, if you're going to go for the top 15, then it's number 16 that I would be most worried about, because we didn't think it was important enough to run a scenario on.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
the approach that I just described, where we literally come up with risk as its own currency, and that kind of points-based type system, where we can now have that stack rank view of base risk. On top of that, what I've also instrumented, if you like, is that we have all these other features, if you like. For example, we have results that come from a vulnerability scan, or it could be a code scan, and we can see what where we've got some security issues within code, and those are things that we can address in shorter order. So on that base risk, we're oftentimes thinking about like architectural changes that we might need to change, or it might be hey, why do we keep this PII data in this particular application? We don't need it.
Right.
So you can actually reduce the overall kind of risk, if you like, that's in there intrinsically. But then these other actual risks, what that allows is that as frequently as you're getting those feeds in of whether it's a scan result or even an environmental change, then you're able to rescore every single platform. And what that does is you then see things to kind of start to move up or down. It's almost like watching the stock exchange, with things moving around. But again, that allows for very specific decision making. So I'll give you an example. Is in our SSDLC, or secure software development lifecycle, or secure systems development lifecycle, even. What we're able to do is we now use the risk score as part of what informs us as to how effective the SSDLC program and processes actually are. So we can literally see the positive impact on the risk score when a particular solution or a particular application is introduced, if you like, to the new SSDLC methodologies that we've transformed to. So there's just so many insights, that this kind of model drives for us, that, like I say, if you exclusively focus on ALE and exclusively focused on scenario-based risk quantification, you don't get that degree of hands-on practical insights in terms of prioritization for the purpose of optimizing the risk profile.
It's very good to hear those insights. Obviously, you're also overseeing third-party risk management, third parties, right? Risk associated with the third parties at Verizon. This thought process of quantification and the advances in that area, how is that changing your view on how to manage risk associated with third parties, or even to some extent, even the fourth parties?
Again, changing in the sense of what it does do for us, Prasad, is it gives us that line of sight, that telemetry, if you like, that previously, that we wouldn't have if we were not doing quantitative risk. Let me say it that way. But specifically with third parties, third party is interesting, because we can think about a third party that we're consuming products, we're buying something from a third party, and they've got code, embedded in their platform or in their solution, or it could be a service provider. And I think one of the interesting things, and when I say we in this context, Prasad, I'm talking about we as a general cybersecurity community, um, we have a kind of strange approach when you think about it. If we have our internal, say IT organization or development shop, and think about the rigor that we put that organization through. For things like code scans and vulnerability scans, and we just put them through a lot, basically, to make sure that the cybersecurity requirements are actually being met. And yet, interestingly, and oftentimes when we go to third party risk, a lot of organizations now, a broader community, tend to just have a very different, like, without the rigor. It's like, okay, so it's almost like a checklist. And do you have a CISO? Okay, well, that's good. Do you have a security firm? Oh, good to know. Do you by chance have a SOC 2 that we could take a look at? Imagine how happy a lot of our IT partners would be if that's all we asked them for. So the point I'm making is we need to have the same degree of rigor to risk management and quantification of that risk over a third party as we do for an internal for an internal delivery organization. I think the challenge that a lot of organizations face is that the techniques have to be different. So we can't just go to a service provider necessarily and demand to be so integrated into their entire operational process and development processes. So we definitely need different techniques, but the need to quantify risk doesn't go away just because we're a third party. In fact, in many ways, we might say, well, the risk is at least as important as it would be for an internal delivery organization. So, like I say, Prasad, just to kind of wrap that up, the requirement, if you like, the need to do quantification of risk for a third party is just as important as an internal. But the techniques and what you measure and how you measure it clearly, has to be different.
Valuable insights there, Gavin. And it's actually a nice segue since you mentioned CISOs. CISOs have a lot on their plate, right, with respect to complying with the regulations, managing their cyber risk strategy and execution of that strategy, to aligning the cyber risk strategy with the, if you will, the business strategy, right? They have a lot on their plate. What would you advise them? What advice would you give them in either day-to-day jobs or overcoming this massive focus or scrutiny they're under?
Yeah, again, it's almost a predictable answer, I think, for Saj. You could probably guess what I'm going to say, but that really is where a good risk management program really, makes all the difference in the world. Because you're right, regardless of the size of the organization, even there is just so much going on in cybersecurity. For a CISO, everything's a priority. Remember they used to say about what's important, what's urgent. Almost everything ends up in the top right hand box, or important and urgent. But I mentioned just briefly earlier that risk is the why we do what we do. So with all of the demands, with the continuous changes in the threat landscape, you mentioned regulatory landscapes as well. So there are changes in regulation that have to be accommodated. So what risk quantification actually does is that for the CISO, it gives the ability to answer the question, so what? So as an example, somebody could say, well, we have a platform over here, and the way it's set up, the password complexity doesn't meet our standards, our policies and standards. And then you can just say, well, so what? And I don't mean that in an argumentative fashion, but it's like, well, why does that matter? Well, if we don't have the password complexity, then this might happen. And then so what? And it's almost like the child asking why 5 times. By the time you've gone through your third so what, you've actually come up with the risk statement. And then for a CISO, what that means then is the ability to know that this one matters so much more than this one does. And so this one needs to get the priority when we're in a scenario where, we've got finite resources.
Even a simple questioning can come a long way in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. I believe we are up on time, and as usual, great to have you and great insights. And thank you very much, Gavin.
Absolutely appreciate it. Look forward to the next time.
Yeah, likewise, Gavin. Thank you.